Welcome to the HR Dialogues, a show where we talk about HR and the future of work. I'm your host, Dr. Veldsman, and today I'm joined by John Rood, founder of Proceptual. Welcome to the HR Dialogues, where we learn from people practitioners as they navigate the emerging world of work. Well, John, welcome to the show.
Hey, Dieter. Nice to be here.
John, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who is John and what brings you to our episode today?
Sure. So I founded about 3 years ago a consultancy in the AI regulation and governance space called Proceptual. So we had started out doing, I think I would call it like highly regulatory type work, a lot of AI auditing, specifically around some of the new laws that were here in the US at the time. And then as that, as our business, as our client base, and then as I think the world of AI has progressed, we now do about roughly half of that kind of regulatory and compliance and governance implementation work. And then about half of our business is training. So we work with, as you would expect, a lot of HR leaders, a lot of learning and development leaders on kind of two things. One of them being how do you actually make AI work in the organization, which is a big topic, and the other being more around like AI safety or literacy.
John, before we dive into the topic, we like to get to know our guests a little bit better. So career advice, what's been something that stuck with you that either somebody mentioned to you in your career or something that just made sense to you at the time?
Yeah, I think it's when I was first starting out as an entrepreneur, I made a mistake that I think a lot of like high performing type people make, which is thinking I had to do it all myself. And then what I realized as I went along and my time as a manager is that for everything that I don't want to do or anything that I am not good at, there's someone who's great at that and would love to do it. So I spend a lot more of my time now on delegation and management and hopefully a lot less time on doing things that I'm not good at, which is a lot of things, like everybody.
I think in the HR space specifically, people tend to hold on to things quite a lot and don't necessarily let go or have this ability to distribute the work. John, I want to deep dive into our topic. And I think, as you've mentioned before, I think AI is everywhere and specifically also around how do we adopt AI safely, but also in a sustainable manner in organizations. And I want to pick your brain a bit today in terms of what are some of the practicalities that you've seen? Because I think in our own data also tells us that when we start thinking about AI readiness in organizations, there's a lot of activity happening, but we still find 30% of organizations don't have a clear strategy necessarily around what value looks like for them pertaining to AI. John, to kickstart, I'm going to ask you this question on what is the biggest mistake organizations make when they're trying to roll out AI?
So the biggest mistake that we see organizations make, and I've seen this both in our own work and then also in the the literature around the topic, is they think that AI should come from the top down. So certainly AI has to be a strategic priority. And so if the CEO and the executive team is not talking and working on AI, it's not going to happen in the organization. That said, the prototypical failed AI implementation that I see over and over is someone senior in the organization says we have to do AI, right? And that's how they always say it. And then what that ends up meaning is they get a Microsoft Copilot license. For some reason, it seems to be always Microsoft Copilot in this situation. And the metric of success is simply use. So, right, we're simply seeing like what percent of the workforce is actually using Microsoft Copilot for anything at all during the workday with no real tie back to the actual organizational priorities. So that to me is the biggest mistake that organizations make.
I think I can definitely echo that, right? So we've also seen, and I don't want to call it mindless experimentation, but it was almost as if there was this pressure from boards to executive teams to say, you need to be doing something with AI. So just get started. We don't really care what it is. And then I think to your point, people defaulted towards buying licenses. And, I teased the client the other day and I said, buying licenses and buying tools is not a strategy. That's kind of a tactic that you utilize. Yeah. So how do we do it differently, John? What is it that you advise? And if we have to almost roll back the time, let's say I'm in an organization, it's the first time I'm finding out about AI. What does my first 90 days look like in a perfect world?
So I like to see a couple of things happen in the first 90 days. The first is we have to figure out at the top level of the organization who is in charge of the AI initiatives. Because, again, when the organization is going to, quote, do AI, oftentimes that gets kind of diffused non-specifically through the leadership team. Just we kind of say everybody has to do AI, but no one's really responsible for it. So in larger organizations, I love to see there be a chief AI officer or something of that nature. Oftentimes, I've seen in large organizations, sometimes the chief of staff in a big company will end up being the chief AI officer for a period of time. So I think it's important to set the leadership at the top. But what we're ultimately trying to do with AI, in my opinion, is we're trying to diffuse that down into the organization. Because in my mind, the most valuable AI implementations are rarely like interesting, sexy technology. They're oftentimes like, we mapped out our workflow in the marketing department, and there's this little thing that we think that AI can do that's going to save us 15 hours a week, something like that. And so that's like a small savings. That's kind of like a little success. But then ultimately you do a lot of those and you start to kind of build a muscle in the organization for how to build out automation successfully. And that's where I think we see significant ROI.
Yeah, I want to double click on something that you've mentioned, because I think what we also notice quite a bit, definitely around the fact that you need, top level sponsorship, but some of the real innovative things around implementation does happen a bit more bottom up, right? In terms of people having safe guardrails to work within, but then at least trying, and I sometimes think, very often decisions are made so far away from where the real work happens. And trying to push that out a bit more and for getting people to be able to say, in my workflow, this is where AI is going to make the most sense, and this is where I actually need to play a role to be able to get there. I love the fact that you mentioned that some of the really valuable AI implementations is not the sexy stuff, right? Sometimes it's the boring, mundane, repeatable things that we do day by day, but incrementally, they are the ones that really make the difference. It was interesting for me in our own organization, we had an AI hackathon a while ago, and all the big projects that kind of won at the end of the day, we realized they had two things in common. The one was there was very clear customer value if we had to implement them. And the second one, they were typically more related towards day-to-day practicalities around that we were fixing through AI as opposed to one silver bullet, type of solution. So, John, how do we not get caught up and kind of run away with the hype and kind of take a very realistic lens towards AI? How do you advise leaders on to get that right?
Well, I think strategically, a lot of this is expectation setting. And I think with any new technology, I think it's hard to get a good grasp on how quickly we'll ultimately get a return. And I think for AI, that's going slower in the majority of organizations than the executives and the board may want or may have expected. But I think it's also really natural. And the way that I think about AI projects is I think about it as you're hiring an AI to do a job. And if you would imagine, working at a company, you said, we're going to take our customer service and we're going to offshore it to, a team in the Philippines or India or whatever. You would expect that to be a big project. You would expect that to take months or possibly even years to return ROI, because you've got to do a ton of training. You've got to do a ton of hiring. Sometimes you hire the wrong people to manage it. Mistakes get made. Output's not perfect on the first day. And that's the experience that organizations, I think, have with AI as well. So I think that if the expectation is, we can, if you look at Twitter or something, it's like, we can replace 100 people on your sales team. Like, that's not actually happening in any organization that I really know. But what we can do instead is say, how can we implement this technology in a way to start kind of like pushing that rock downhill a little bit, which is building kind of the infrastructure around governance and around safety and around managing the ROI, and about how to teach the organization how to actually do it, right? And that doesn't and again, if that just comes from the CEO, it just comes from the CTO. That's not as effective as if it's more diffuse in the organization.
But that is a different type of muscle, right? So I think the expectation setting is one part of it, but also what you mentioned, which I very much agree with, is the fact that you're almost going through a bit of a workforce transition around who does the work and where is the work being done. And I think that always takes time in organizations to adapt and to kind of set the tone for that new reality and for that new culture. John, you use the words governance and safety. Now, I'll play devil's advocate here for a moment. And usually when you hear the word governance, most people are like, oh, slow, bureaucratic, why on earth is it there? It's just another thing that we need to look into. My experience, however, at the moment is very much, and I would love your thoughts on this, is that in the AI space, it's actually governance that gives you the structure to be able to, one, find the value, to set the guardrails, to make sure that it is adopted in a sustainable, safe manner as well. So what do you refer to when you talk about governance around AI implementation and adoption?
So when we think about governance, and we do a ton of governance implementation work, we're thinking about the set of policies and behaviors that guide the use of AI in the workforce and in the company. There's a couple big components to that, and certainly one of them, which I listed first because it really is the most important. Like, there really is a critical safety issue, right? There are critical issues around the use of private data, access to things like medical records, HR records, et cetera. Those are real and significant issues. The second part of that, though, is that there's a significant regulatory push in this direction. You and your audience are no doubt aware of the EU AI Act. We do a lot of work with that regulation. We have a number of laws here in the States as well. And so global organizations really have to start thinking about, with all of these measures going into effect over the next 2 years, like, what is the strategy for getting out ahead of that compliance hurdle?
So what would be the areas, if I'm an HR professional, that you would kind of wave a bit of a red flag to me to say, make sure that you are doing the right things in these different areas, because they are kind of adopting AI at different speeds?
So in the HR world, the critical issue in AI safety is bias. And bias is not new. Like, we didn't that's not like a new idea in the last 2 years. Bias existed before AI. I'm actually I'm optimistic that we can reduce bias in hiring with AI over the years, but to get there, we have to be really sure that the technology that we use, the software that we buy, is evaluating our candidates fairly, is doing things like ranking resumes, decisions about hiring, promotion, compensation, and benefits. All those things, to the extent that they're going through AI, we have to be really careful as the users of those systems that they're doing the right thing. So there's kind of two questions there. Like, one of them is, what AI do we use internally? Do we develop internally that touches HR? But the much larger question is, how do we get assurance that the technology that we're buying from our vendors kind of meets our standard for bias mitigation and prevention?
And there's also, for me, a bit of a question there around, you're going to walk into a bigger AI ecosystem in your organization, whether that's now within HR or HR touching other other systems and other vendors that we are working with. And I think your point is bed down. What are some of the standards and principles that we hold ourselves accountable to make sure that we ask the right questions and put the right controls in place? Now, John, you mentioned earlier, and it's something that we also highlighted in our trends report for next year, around this idea that where there's a chief AI officer, there has to be some sort of ownership, but there also has to be a multidisciplinary structure that actually provides different points of views when we start thinking about AI adoption a little bit broader. Is this something you see a lot of organizations doing? And I know size will play a role and resource will play a role there as well, but what's the best way to approach, if I may call it, that steering committee around AI, or the structures you put in place?
So first of all, and you had pointed this out, it differs based on size and complexity of the organization. So what works for a startup for this is going to be very different than what works for a much larger business, and then what works for example, like a children's toy manufacturer will be very different from what works for a highly regulated industry like healthcare, education, HR actually being one of them, things like defense, physical infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. And those are all listed in the EU AI Act, right, as the quote unquote high risk implementations of artificial intelligence. So if we were saying, we're a relatively large organization and we have to think about who are the right people to put on our AI steering committee. One of them is whoever's sitting in that seat as AI champion, sometimes we call it. So sometimes that's chief AI officer. Sometimes it's a different title. Number two, I think you can't not have the CEO of the organization in that seat. It's important to have people that are non-technical. And there's two reasons for that. one of them is, I think it's a good idea because they bring a different perspective. And the other, again, is a regulatory compliance issue, right? Because the EU AI Act says very specifically that on your AI governance committee, you have to have a cross-functional team, and it's got to include people that are not the ones actually building the AI products. So we want to have the AI leader, the CEO of the business, at least one person who's not technical. Oftentimes, we love to see an investor or a board member on there as well, because I think that can bring a broader outside perspective. And then after that, I think it's very organization dependent after that. But I think those are kind of like the 4 or 5 like seats that you really want to see filled.
I'm obviously biased, and I'm not touching on your previous topic there, but I think what we've also tried to promote quite a bit is that you need to have some shape or form of the people voice there. So whether that is HR or elsewhere, that also just broadens the conversation beyond the technical parameters of what technology are we buying, how are we looking after it, etc. And it just brings in a bit of the lens pertaining to culture. Now, I want to ask you the question, because you do a lot of work also pertaining to AI literacy and upskilling. What does AI literacy mean when we just kind of try to explain it to a 12-year-old? What does AI literacy mean?
So I think it's an amazing question, and it's funny. Like I kind of have like a legal and compliance mind sometimes. So my first answer always kind of goes back to those terms are sort of badly defined in some of the regulations. For example, EU AI Act being probably the most obvious. It's not really clear from the act what that actually means. It says, paraphrasing, but you've got to teach the people that are using AI the skills that they need to actually do the thing, right? Like to actually build the AI and do it safely. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, in an organization, there'll usually be several levels of AI literacy requirements. At the top level, you'd have kind of the education and experience that you'd want to see in that AI steering committee, right? So that will be topics like, you can't sit on the AI steering committee if you don't fundamentally know how AI systems work, right? So there's some technical expertise, although I don't think you have to be like a developer. And then I think you have to have a pretty significant foundation in AI ethics, AI safety, regulatory environment as well. And then from there, think about it kind of like as a pyramid, like kind of go down the pyramid. At the bottom of the pyramid, there's like a base of knowledge. And that base of knowledge, in our opinion, has to be disseminated throughout the organization, right? Like fundamentally, anyone using a computer at work needs to know certain things about AI, right? And those are usually, in my mind, safety related, right? So how do you manage bias? How do you avoid scams? How do you protect the information and the IP and the trademarks of the organization? Fundamentally, how do you protect actual real people, like human people, from your use of AI, right? And we get so many calls where someone in the organization, like a junior person, not the CTO, not your head developer, but just a regular person down in the marketing department, has uploaded some spreadsheet that had all the names of our patients or customers or whatever, and that's what kind of sets off the need for AI governance and AI literacy. That to me shows like there's a really fundamental need and throughout the organization for that level of safety training.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think something that, and maybe there's 2 points to make there. The first one, that I think it's also okay for everybody to understand that not everybody needs to become an expert in all things AI. Because I think that's often quite a big barrier for a lot of people to say, but where do I start? This is completely foreign and new to me. However, having said that, and I think I think it's even more so important with AI, but I don't think it's dissimilar than what some of the previous technologies were as well. There is a baseline proficiency that we do need within the organization quite a bit, and something we refer to quite a bit, and you've mentioned as well, is there needs to be some basic education. Just know what it is and how it's useful and what it can and can't do. Understand what are the risks involved pertaining to that, how to use it safely, and just how to play with it in a way that actually makes sense, that leads to value in your own type of working environment, just at a very, very basic level. Whereas I do think then, to your point, where you start getting to the steering committee, you do need deep-seated expertise in various different areas pertaining to that. John, I want to double click on AI ethics, because I think it's a word that gets used quite a lot and quite broadly as well. Mm-hmm. When we talk about AI ethics, and I'm going to come back to the literacy piece in a moment, but just help us understand AI ethics. What does that mean in really simple terms when we start referring to its importance in organizations?
At the very most fundamental level, AI ethics is about the concept of alignment, right? So how do we get AI systems that we develop or buy or use to make sure those are aligned with what us as like human beings want them to do? And how can we be thoughtful about how our use of AI affects other people? That to me is that alignment question is the most foundational. The next level up is we discuss oftentimes this kind of simplified model, which we call the three cornerstones. And the three cornerstones are transparency, bias prevention or bias mitigation, and explainability, right? And so bias prevention we've already talked about. Transparency fundamentally is, do actual human beings know that they are that they're working with an AI, talking to an AI, interacting with an AI, that an AI is making a decision? In our HR context, most fundamentally, that's in the hiring process, right? So if we are sending our resume out into the ether, it's our right as people to know that that's not being read by a person, that's being read first by an AI. And then the third cornerstone, as I had said, is explainability, right? So AI systems have to make decisions in a way that that normal people can interpret those decisions, because ultimately that's how we manage things like bias, right? So if we have a resume screener and we ask the AI, why did you give such a low score to this resume? And we say, oh, it's because this was a woman. That's a really bad thing, but that's much better than the alternative of we don't ask and it doesn't say, right? Because one of those is clearly bad and fixable, and the other is very bad and obscure or opaque.
I think especially in the HR space, the explainability piece is going to become critically important when people start looking at AI adoption across different functions and practices, etc., within the HR field. And to your point, I mean, there's a couple of horror stories running around at the moment around applications and things like performance management, where we've completely taken the human being out of the process, and just the negative impact that has on the human being sitting on the other side of the proverbial table. And I think that's some of the things that we need to think about when we start thinking about what is the impact of AI within the organization on the human element and on the culture of the business. John, I want to come back to the skill component, because we've spoken about the fact that AI literacy and AI fluency, whichever way you want to refer to it, needs to be built within the organization. It kind of needs to be unlocked and harnessed. How do we do that?
So I think that I agree with you that it's a mistake to focus on tools, right? Because if we don't know what job we're doing, we don't know what tools will be necessary. So what I like to think about as we think about, bringing AI into the organization is fundamentally what most people in the work context are going to be doing with AI is either generative or is automation. And the generative one is much easier to conceptualize and to teach, right? The part that's harder is the automation part. This is a little bit more kind of like future looking, but if you go on Twitter today, everyone's talking about like vibe coding or no code coding with AI. And right now that's like kind of like an obscure skill where it's like some guys in like the basement are doing that. But that's fundamentally going to be how business is done in 3 to 5 years, right? So the way that we today, we would never like add up like our sales on like a notepad or something. We use Excel. The same way is if we have a job to be done in 3 to 5 years, there's no way that we say like, okay, well, we have to go like buy some expensive SaaS from somewhere, or we have to ask the IT team. The marketing team, the sales team, the finance team, the HR team is going to be able to spin up their own application to do that work as a prototype to get that process started. And I completely believe that that's like the near future. So when we go to teach, what we want to teach is we're not really teaching we don't teach like vibe coding because the tools are going to change so rapidly. What we're teaching instead is how do you start to think in a systematic way about automations, right? So instead of tools, we want to teach techniques. We want to teach about how to think through the problems at hand. So in my mind, when organizations come to us all the time and say that, have the exact same question that you had suggested, which is like, again, like we know we need to do AI. Thankfully, they know they need help, right?
John, let's make it practical and obviously without disclosing any confidential information. Can you give us some case studies of companies that are doing this really well or going about it in the right way? You've already mentioned the example of, companies come to you at least knowing they need help and asking the question. But tell us a little bit, what does it look like when we are doing this right?
So I think when you're doing it right, first of all, we step back and think about, what is the governance structure or the governance program that we need to put in place. When we talk about governance, oftentimes we'll talk about a management system, and it really is a system for managing AI as opposed to like, a two-page policy or something like that. The entire organization has to be built into the management system. It requires regular meetings, and it requires, that AI steering committee that we had talked about previously, meets at least once a quarter, if not more often. But I think it has to start there. And if the organization isn't kind of willing to commit and saying like, here's our vision for AI, here's what we want to accomplish, here's the safeguards that we'll put in place, and then those things ultimately lead out to, what are the training and the policies that we want to put in place for the rest of the workforce. So I think there's like a 30-day strategic sprint with senior leaders that needs to be done and done right for an organization to really adopt AI successfully.
I love the fact also that there's this, I believe organizations fundamentally run on rituals and rhythms, right? I think it ingrains into the organizational DNA and fabric, a way of being and a way of looking at the business. And I think AI is going to be similar, right? It has to form part of our natural rhythms. John, I want to turn the question around a bit, right? So if I'm looking at my organization, what are some of the signals or signs that I should be looking out for that tells me I'm on the wrong path or that things are going in the wrong direction?
So my favorite example of this now is shadow AI. And you've heard that term. If the audience hasn't heard it, shadow AI fundamentally is use of AI in the workforce that is apart from the official approved uses of AI. And the most frequent place where we see this happening, again, I'm always talking about Microsoft Copilot. The number one place this happens is the CTO buys everyone a Microsoft Copilot license. They do a 30-minute training, and then the security folks, the privacy folks, and the compliance folks, who I count myself as one of them, get their hands on it and lock it down so hard that it is clearly worse than what they can get on their mobile on ChatGPT for free. And then you see people, they have their official version, but they want to get any work done. Like they kind of like do it under the table. They do it at home. They get out their laptop. And that's where we see that's what shadow AI is. And that's where a lot of the risk is involved, right? So, most organizations of any size have good privacy and security people. But there's definitely that tension there between the quality and the speed of the AI systems that we use and our level of comfort as security and privacy personnel with how to kind of lock those systems down. So there's a real tension there. It's not an easy answer.
Yeah, I smile because I think of the tension. What we've seen quite a couple of times is, we do all the great work of educating people. We then give them access to certain tool sets, and then we say, okay, but you can't use X, Y, and Z. And then I think this shadow AI piece does pop up a little bit more. And I can also, have a little bit of compassion then with, organizations not necessarily just wanting to let it out and reign free. But to your point, if people find that they don't want to be left behind in their own individual capacity either, they are going to go and seek some of these other tool sets. And there's just so many available, especially in the free versions. There's so much that you can still do, related to that. So I do believe with you that that's going to be a real type of risk there. John, how do we prevent that without now the regulatory governance pieces that we've spoken about? How do we create that awareness with our workforce about how to do this responsibly?
I've got a really simple answer, and it's just training, right? So we've been talking about it, for 30 minutes, and this is the right conversation that organizations hopefully are listening to, and then should be having internally themselves, which is fundamentally AI risk and AI opportunity come down to people and not to technology, right? Because the technology is going to change fast. Ultimately, the way that we empower our people is how effective we'll be able to be with the tools, like regardless of what the tools are going to be. So if we teach our people to use AI safely, to have kind of that ethical perspective that we had discussed in mind, but then also to have to understand like how to look for places where we can do automation, right? Not just email drafting, but actually solve problems. That's where we start to be successful. And that's a big mindset shift. That's a big upskilling, reskilling problem. But that's, in 3 years, someone who said, I don't know how to build my own app in AI would be like someone now saying, I don't know how to type, or like, I don't know how to use like a web browser. It would be inconceivable in the professional world.
John, before I start wrapping up for us, the last question, and I want to try to put you on the spot a little bit and gaze into your crystal ball. What does this picture look like in 3 years' time?
I think that we will have many, many more small businesses. I think we'll have a lot more businesses that are 10 people or less that get substantially large in terms of their revenue, in terms of their reach. And I think that that'll be kind of like a watershed moment. I think we're already kind of seeing that, like the size of startups that get to be successful now are so much smaller. And when we think about like, if that does come to pass, how does that affect, the way that we as HR leaders operate? Number one, there's going to be a lot more vendors. There's going to be a lot more integration. There's going to be a lot more training options. Because I think that, to use an example, one of the big problems that HR leaders have now is like you post a job. I'm sure your readers or your listeners will have this issue. You post a job, and then like 20 minutes later, you have 1,000 applications, right? And it's all AI auto apply, and of course, then we have tools to screen those. But then the auto apply people have rules to get by our screeners, and it's kind of this like cat and mouse game back and forth. And that's going to be one of the big challenges in HR is like in this world where there's many more vendors, many more products, and where our applicants are also enabled with AI. How do we actually hire the right people? So that's my crystal ball.
John, a couple of things that stood out for me, and thank you very much for sharing your experience and your wisdom with us. I think the first one is definitely around the importance of governance and safety and making sure that that's the baseline level that we think about in our organizations whenever we think about AI adoption. Love the fact that we spoke about the fact that it's not necessarily always the sexy solutions that drive the most value. Very often it's the practical workflows and automations that we put in place that really drives the benefit for the organization, for the individuals in the longer term. We spoke about the fact also around the fact that governance is about policies and behaviors that we want to drive within organizations and how we set those things up with a multidisciplinary steering committee, and depending on the size of the organization, the industry and the context and the requirements, that is going to look vastly different for different organizations. What also stood out for me very much is this idea around AI literacy at different levels and your triangle around how do we look at different things that people are going to require different things there. And then the call out also around changing regulations and making sure that there's transparency, bias detection, and then explainability in everything that we do around AI. John, from my side, thank you very, very much. Where can people find you and follow you in the great work that you're doing at Proceptual?
So Dieter, thanks for asking. So so that you can come to the website, the Proceptual website, which I'm sure we'll have in the show notes. I'll make sure that you've got my LinkedIn. So follow me on LinkedIn, connect with me, send me a message. If this resonates with people, I'd love to have these discussions. So if folks have questions, want to talk about AI literacy and governance, like happy to talk.
Perfect, John. Thank you very much. And for everybody dialing in, thank you for joining us for this episode of the HR Dialogues. We will see you in our next show shortly. Bye-bye.